Maupassant Syndrome. Madness, or perhaps I should say mental illness, had always run in my family. It was always part of my world. My earliest and most vivid childhood memories are of my great-grandfather. His red-rimmed, haunted eyes, that incessant, nervous twitching, his wild cries in the night. Of course, I didn't understand it at the time. All I remember is that I found him very frightening. My mother did her best to comfort me, to explain that he wasn't well, and that he imagined things, horrible things that weren't really there. Whatever reasons she gave me, they did little to assuage my fears. All I knew was that I found him frightening and oddly repulsive, and whenever I was taken to his house, it was with a deep sense of trepidation and fear. Growing up, I was always close to my grandparents and would stay with them at their house every weekend. During those early formative years, my granddad was my best friend and mentor. He had endless patience and pep, and was always tinkering with some enthralling new project or hobby, and I was always his assistant. We would spend hours drawing and modelling, shooting targets in the yard, playing games, or pottering at his allotment garden. By contrast, my father often ignored me. He was always so distracted, his time and attention wholly consumed by his work. On Saturday nights, after my grandma had retired to bed to read her book, my granddad would make us hot buttered toast and tea, and I'd sit by the open fire while he recanted stories of his working life and his exploits, and of his time in the Navy during World War II. Those tales of daring do were always my favourites. On Sunday mornings, while my grandma went to church, we would take meandering walks in the countryside. At the time, I considered these great adventures, wandering the leafy, wooded paths with my granddad and his big old, half-wild German shepherd. Those were idyllic days looking back. All that changed when his father, my great-grandfather, died. With his father's death, a dark depression descended over my granddad, and his jovial personality changed seemingly overnight. He became insular and spiteful, agitated and deeply disturbed. As the weeks and months wore on, his mental and emotional state deteriorated badly, until he too was a bedridden invalid, consumed by perplexing and elusive terrors, the nature of which none of us, not even his doctors, could unravel. It seemed to all concerned that he had succumbed to the same cryptic malady that had, during his final years, afflicted his father. My grandmother took this change in her husband very hard. She was worn out from her efforts to care for him, and not a little frightened by his wild, inexplicable claims, by his incessant frightened whispers, and the violent outbursts of rage and terror that eventually led to his installation in a comfortable private room at Prestwick Sanatorium, situated at the edge of town. It was a blessing and something of a relief for her, though she never admitted it when he was taken away. She tended to him every day after that, but despite her dedication and her devoted care, there was little she could do to alleviate his suffering. His previous sunny demeanour had been utterly erased by this new blight, and once it had taken hold of him, he was never the same again. My own grief at the loss, not at the death of my great-grandfather, but of my best friend to this frantic depression, drove me to withdraw. Too young to understand and unable to grasp the complexities of my own despair and resentment, I became insular and insecure. The doctors who attended my granddad were convinced his illness was congenital, that some pernicious strain of genetic malignancy was responsible for his decline, that it, like Alzheimer's disease, had a tendency to lay dormant until the onset of old age seemed clear, that it was inherited, and followed the paternal line was in evidence, and was an inference none could ignore in the light of the family's medical history. This fact needled at my father. He became concerned, and later obsessed by the fear that he would be next in line to suffer his father's fate, that at some point in the future, he too would capitulate to the illusory horrors and the ensuing madness of an inescapable condition that had already killed his own grandfather, and now held his father in a straitjacket of frenzied fear. The doctors diagnosed my granddad's illness as Maupassant Syndrome, a vanishingly rare condition of which little was known. For a time, my dear old granddad was the subject of keen interest among certain psychiatrists and brain surgeons specializing in such outre-cognitive disorders. Even now, when I think of it, I feel a pang of latent fear and regret at the thought of my old granddad, locked away in that austere hospital on the hill. Looking back, I remember, as a child, I imagined I could hear him screaming in the night, on the farthest rim of audible perception, across all those intervening miles of streets and houses. He never recovered. The man I'd known in my youth, my best friend and mentor, with his boundless generosity of spirit and jovial persona, was gone, buried beneath the crushing weight of those incessant, frantic hallucinations that, forever after, bore down on his soul. As the years passed, he diminished, both mentally and physically, until, at the end, little remained of him but bones and screams, and wild staring eyes that seemed to glow inexplicably in the darkness. My father followed him in his decline, though his plight was, during that period, wholly self-inflicted, a symptom of his own burgeoning fears. He became, as time passed and his father deteriorated, more and more convinced that he would be next, that he too, in his turn, would succumb to the cryptic familial disorder that ran through his bloodline. Though the doctors assured him that he showed no signs of mental or physical infirmity, he remained convinced of his fate, and by degrees he distanced himself from his father. He couldn't bear to look at him, or listen to his plaintive cries. He seemed to imagine that the mere presence of the man might provoke the onset of the condition within himself, and he began to avoid our visits, making excuses whenever the family went to see the old man at the sanitarium. In the end, my father shunned him altogether, on account of his own health. He never saw him again after that, until the night my granddad died. Both my parents were there at his passing, having been summoned by the hospital staff late one evening in December. I waited anxiously outside with my aunt, lost in my own grief, and disturbed by certain nervous speculations I could not wholly repudiate. My father fled town alone that same night, emptied his bank accounts, and just disappeared. Just what had prompted his sudden desertion was unclear, though it was doubtless connected with the demise of his father. My mother and I were left in dire straits, both financially and emotionally. That was a difficult time, but the family rallied around to our aid, and with their help and care, we managed to pull through. We neither saw nor heard anything of him for nearly 9 years after that. Our lives had moved on. My mother had remarried, while I had been away to university and was now working in the city. My wife had recently given birth to our son, Adam, when one night, out of the blue, my mother received a telephone call from the police. My father had been discovered, homeless and raving in San Francisco. Just how he'd got there, and why, and what on earth he'd been up to during those intervening years, was a mystery. We were advised that he was to be deported, due in part to his lapsed visa, and that the British consul had already arranged a flight back to London. In light of his dubious mental condition, a room at the Prestwick Sanitarium was secured for his accommodation, and he was transported directly to the facility upon his arrival. Incredulous at the sudden reappearance of my father after so long, I nevertheless took a short leave of absence from work and hurried home, visiting him in his room at the hospital on the following night. He was in a shocking state, and at first I barely recognized the man, but there was no denying that it was him. He had undergone a shocking transformation during the years of his absence, and he now bore an uncanny resemblance to my poor deceased grandfather, or rather, to the withered gargoyle he became after his illness had gnawed him body and soul down to the bone. He, conversely, recognized me at once, though he hadn't laid eyes on me for the best part of a decade. Grasping my arm as I approached the bedside, with an astonishingly powerful grip for one so hideously extenuated by long years of insanity and material neglect, his eyes held that same haunting look of hysteria my grandfather's had had all those years before, and his voice was a thin, quavering whisper, as he leant oppressively close to my ear and spoke.
It's always with me. It's here now in the room.
He shot a quick, apprehensive glance over his shoulder as he said this, then returned his red-rimmed eyes to me, eyes that burned with a dreadful intensity. He gripped my hand tighter.
I tried to get away, but it always found me. It was always with me.
Clawing tears from his eyes, he went on.
Son, I need you to help me. End it. Would you do that for your poor father?
He tried to smile then, but the effect was anything but appealing, and I half pulled away in disgust as his face cracked into a sardonic rictus, whose piercing, tear-stained eyes vacillated between hope and guilt and half-concealed terror. Despite his fierce protestations, the doctors had him sedated after that outburst, and I was led away, for the moment overwhelmed by a confrontation that had left me in a state of nervous confusion, of revulsion and guilt. My mother shunned him, unable to forgive him for his desertion of us so many years before, though I suspected even then, and know for certain now, that there was more to it than simple resentment, that her flat rejection masked a vein of genuine fear beneath that cowl of prosaic indignation. For the next 18 months, I called on him each week without fail, though on each occasion the experience left me drained and depressed, and harbour to unsettling concerns regarding the state of my own mental health. Again and again he implored me to help him, that it would never let him be. His torment was evident to all, and with each passing week, as I evaded his appeals, his pleas became ever more emphatic. His mood and demeanour devolved rapidly, reducing him in time to a raving, incoherent creature, incapable of speech or thought, a screaming, bedridden monster that needs must be restrained for the safety of itself and all those who came into contact with it. One night in late June, I received a telephone call informing me that he had been moved to the ICU unit, that he was now in very poor health, and that the end was near. I hurried to his bedside, but by the time I arrived, he was already heavily sedated. He was on a respirator, and though unconscious and supine on the gurney, his heart was racing. It was deeply unnerving to observe the manner with which he twitched and writhed against his restraints, as though locked in physical combat with some unseen, yet corporeal adversary. He fought a losing battle as the night wore on. All the while the doctors did all they could to keep him alive. At 3 a.m, the lead consultant took me aside and confided that there was nothing more to be done. My father was clearly in distress, and in his view the kindest thing to do now would be to shut off the respirator and allow him to slip away with dignity. I knew that was the right thing to do, and I hesitantly agreed, all the while fighting to quell the fearful imaginings that haunted me, suspicions regarding my own relationship with the cryptic malady that had for generations afflicted my familiar line. I cast such doubts aside, eschewing them as mere superstition, telling myself that to entertain such notions was to invite them into being. After all, there was nothing to indicate any particular issues with my own mental health. I was led away to sign the paperwork, and by the time I returned to his bedside, he was gone. The change in him was shocking. Just minutes before, though at the very extremity of distress, he had been alive and animate. Now he lay static, a statue in pallid grey flesh, all signs of life utterly erased. He looked as though he'd been dead for a fortnight, as though he'd never lived and breathed and walked. I was staggered by this transformation, but at least, I told myself, he was now at peace. I lingered as the medical staff worked to uncouple my father from the machines and carried out the sundry tasks connected with the passing of their patient. He lay in their midst, an empty husk now, The spark of vitality that had animated him in life departed. Despite the harrowing events of the night, his passing had come as something of a relief. It was over, wasn't it? Did his mouth move just then? It was open now, wide open. It hadn't been like that a second before. But how could it move? I glanced at the doctor, but he was unaware, engaged in hushed conversation with the attendant nurse. Perhaps it was normal. I had heard somewhere that corpses had been known to move, to exhale even after death, as certain tensions lingering in the body relaxed. Perhaps such a thing had happened here. It was certainly disconcerting, and I'd almost convinced myself that this had been the case here, when his mouth moved again. I gasped involuntarily. Something was emerging from the void of his open mouth, a black, slug-like protuberance probing its way blindly out onto the lower lip. I glanced again at the doctor, unable to speak or move. He was oblivious, as was the nurse, as they completed some paperwork. The black slug was joined by another, and another. Then the whole hand jerked into view, its thin, palsied fingers twitching and clenching as it slid upward, revealing a slick, bony arm. Oil black and glistening in the subdued light, it collapsed across my father's chest. Then, gaining purchase there, pressed down as a second hand crept out onto my father's dead cheek from within, like a fat, black spider. I couldn't breathe or move, my mind utterly stalled as it struggled to conceptualize a happening wholly external to any normal schema of life. Paralyzed, I watched as the thing crawled impossibly out of my dead father's gaping mouth, dropping out of sight to the tiles with a wet slap on the far side of the gurney. I tried to speak, to move. I could do neither. The medical staff around me, absorbed in their work, were oblivious to the monstrous and inexplicable sight I had just witnessed, and they went on about their tasks while I remained transfixed and unable to communicate. For a full minute it lay out of sight on the tiles. I don't think I even breathed. Then it appeared, rising slowly from behind my father's corpse. The black silhouette of the head first, its face obscured, its lank hair hanging in wet strands. Then the eyes appeared, small and pale against the black. Suddenly, in the blink of an eye, it was before me, inches from my face, its eyes sallow and gleaming, a sardonic smile peeling open the lower half of its face, revealing a red maw, studded with rotten fangs. I recoiled in horror and disgust, its ice-cold breath on my lips. Its smile broadened sickeningly at my reaction, and somehow, for a split second, that haunting spell of paralysis was broken. I fled, skirting around the thing before me and barging headlong into the doctor, sending the man staggering. I burst out of the door and into the bright, strip-lit hospital hallway, heading for the double doors at the farther end. A wide-eyed porter stepped aside as I flew past him. Wrenching the door open, I stopped abruptly, my knees locked, my heart in my throat, a jet of adrenaline surging in my chest. It stood beyond the door, that same smile painted across its hideous face.
You cannot escape me,
it said cynically. Even then, on some level, I knew it to be true. But some base instinct for survival, embedded in the brainstem since the dawn of life, insisted that I try. I span on my heel and took off back along the corridor, only to find it waiting for me, its frail form twitching in neurotic ecstasy at the farther end. Not long after that, I was caught and subdued by hospital security staff, sedated and delivered to my own room for observation. All agreed that I'd been under a lot of strain, with the sudden return of my wayward father, his deteriorating mental condition, and now his untimely death. Clearly, it had all been too much, and under the advice of the doctor, my wife agreed that I should be kept at the hospital for a period of convalescence. no one paid heed to the wild claims I made of the demon thing that haunts me, deeming them an unfortunate side effect of the stress and of my subsequent mental illness. It runs in the family, they concluded, and they shut me up in this cell for my own good. That was 5 years ago. Tonight, as always, I lay strapped to the bed, helpless and naked and shivering with fear. The thing lays almost lovingly beside me, but none can see it save for me. Its ice-cold breath freezing the back of my neck, its jet-black, palsied fingers gently caressing my cheek. Ever and again it reaches down to choke me with an iron grip that takes me just up to, but never beyond the point of unconsciousness. All the while it whispers of the pain and terror it has in store, of the games it will play with me, hidden here, forever beside me, out of sight. The only thing that still keeps me sane, if sane I am, is the knowledge that, as long as I can endure the torment of the thing's perverse pleasures, my little son will be free. You have been listening to Maupassant Syndrome, episode 13 of Savage Bites. In this story, I was really interested in blurring the lines between the paranormal and mental illness. It seems to me that monsters, no matter how big and scary and frightening they can be, you can kind of get away, you can escape from them. Whereas I think mental illness can be even more frightening. It might even be the most frightening thing of all, because if the monster is inside your head, there's literally no way you can escape it. And I thought that might be a pretty cool idea for a story. I did the painting first and then came up with the story afterwards. Sometimes it's the other way around, but it's cool because they kind of feed off each other. So it's really quite a fertile way of developing ideas. So the name for the story. Any of you who are familiar with the work of Guy de Maupassant, amazing short story writer and horror writer also. So he wrote a story called The Horror, which is the tale of a nobleman who's haunted by an invisible vampire, basically. So there are obviously quite a lot of similarities between the two stories. And I kind of thought about calling it Horror Syndrome, but I thought that might be too on the nose, and I thought that those of you who were familiar with Guy de Maupassant's story would get the whole thing too quickly. So I wanted to be more tangential, so I called it Maupassant Syndrome. Hopefully you think that works. So thanks so much for listening. If you enjoyed the story, please smash that like button, subscribe to the channel, and please just share the story with any friends of yours who are horror fans or into creepypasta or anything like that. Thanks very much, and I'll see you in the next one.